and welcome to the Soul of History channel. The afternoon sun filtered through the Georgian windows of the mansion, casting golden patterns across the polished oak floors. Margaret Pemberton adjusted the arrangement of white peonies in the entrance hall for the third time, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of social events throughout 25 years of marriage. Every detail of the anniversary party had been planned months in advance, from the champagne selection to the soft lighting in the glass-enclosed salon that would offer views of the meticulously manicured gardens. The sound of the intercom made her look up. On the security screen, a black taxi was stopping at the wrought-iron gates. Margaret frowned. She wasn't expecting any guests before 7 o'clock. When the vehicle door opened and a familiar figure emerged, carrying only a small brown leather suitcase, Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Emma, her daughter. 2 years of near-total silence, communication reduced to perfunctory text messages on birthdays and holidays, and now there she was, walking up the gravel drive as if she had never left. "Mrs. Pemberton?" James, the head of private security, spoke through the intercom. "Shall I open the gates?" Margaret hesitated for a moment that felt like eternity. "Yes, James. It's my daughter." In the second-floor study, Charles Pemberton pretended not to hear the commotion of the arrival. He kept his eyes fixed on the documents scattered across the mahogany desk, but the words blurred before his eyes. The Morrison versus Hart case, a corporate corruption scandal that had been keeping him awake for weeks, suddenly seemed trivial compared to the emotional minefield that had just walked through his front door. He heard Margaret's heels clicking rapidly across the marble foyer, the rushed whispers to the catering staff, the subtle panic in her voice as she tried to maintain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond her careful planning. Charles removed his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. Emma's timing was impeccable, as always, arriving just early enough to disrupt the evening's choreography, but not early enough to be accused of deliberate sabotage. From his bedroom window on the third floor, Henry Pemberton watched his granddaughter pay the taxi driver. At 78, Henry had developed the patience that comes with age and the wisdom that comes with watching family dynamics repeat themselves across generations. Emma moved with the same determined stride that had characterized her grandmother Elizabeth, the same woman whose secrets still haunted this house like ghosts in Georgian clothing. Emma paused at the front door, her hand hovering over the brass knocker. For a moment, she looked like the uncertain child she had once been, seeking permission to enter her own home. But the moment passed, and she pressed the doorbell with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world without her family's approval. Margaret opened the door with a smile that was both genuine and carefully constructed. "Emma, darling, what a wonderful surprise." And the words carried the weight of 2 years of unspoken conversations, of phone calls that went to voicemail, of Christmas cards sent to a London address that never replied. "Hello, Mother." Emma stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the unchanged interior. The same silk wallpaper, the same crystal chandelier, the same portrait of great-grandfather Pemberton watching sternly from above the fireplace. Nothing had changed, as if time itself had been suspended in her absence. "Are you staying for the party?" Margaret asked, her tone carefully neutral. She had learned through painful experience that showing too much enthusiasm would only drive Emma further away. "I wouldn't miss it," Emma replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. She set down her suitcase and removed her jacket, a simple black blazer that Margaret immediately recognized as expensive, but deliberately understated. Even in her rebellion, Emma maintained the family's instinctive understanding of quality. Charles appeared at the top of the staircase, his tall frame filling the Georgian archway. Father and daughter regarded each other across the entrance hall like diplomats from warring nations, each measuring the other's intentions. "Emma," his voice carried the formal warmth he reserved for difficult clients. "It's good to see you." "Is it?" The question hung in the air like incense, sweet but suffocating. Henry descended the stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the polished banister. "My dear girl," he said, and his voice carried none of the careful calculation of his son or daughter-in-law. "You look exactly like your grandmother at that age." For the first time since arriving, Emma smiled genuinely. "Hello, grandfather." As the afternoon light began to fade outside the tall windows, the Pemberton family stood in their entrance hall, surrounded by the trappings of success and respectability, each acutely aware that the evening ahead would test the foundations of everything they had built together and everything they had torn apart. With Emma installed in her childhood bedroom, the family machinery shifted into a higher gear of controlled chaos. Margaret moved through the house like a general preparing for battle, issuing discreet instructions to the catering staff while simultaneously recalculating seating arrangements in her head. The crystal glasses needed to be positioned just so. The lighting in the conservatory required adjustment, and somehow she needed to brief the security team about Emma's presence without making it seem like a crisis. Emma stood before her old bedroom mirror, contemplating the dress she had brought from London. It was elegant, a midnight blue silk that complemented her dark hair, but she knew it would irritate her mother in subtle ways. The neckline was slightly too daring for Surrey standards, the length just a fraction shorter than conservative propriety demanded. It was a small rebellion, but in the Pemberton household, small rebellions carried the weight of declarations of war. The room around her remained exactly as she had left it 2 years ago. Margaret had preserved it like a shrine to the daughter she had lost to London journalism and idealistic notions about truth-telling. The university acceptance letters still sat on the desk, Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, all offering pathways to respectability that Emma had rejected in favour of a bachelor's degree in journalism from a less prestigious institution and a job at an investigative magazine that her parents, her friends, had never heard of. Charles knocked on the doorframe with the careful politeness he reserved for witnesses he wasn't sure he could trust. "May I come in?" Emma nodded, continuing to apply lipstick in the mirror. In the reflection, she watched her father survey the room as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the debate team trophies, the academic achievement certificates, the evidence of a daughter who had once seemed destined to follow in his legal footsteps. "How is London treating you?" he asked, settling into the reading chair that had once been her refuge during adolescent storms. "London is London," Emma replied, turning to face him. "Expensive, demanding, honest." The word honest hung between them like a challenge. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit Emma remembered from childhood, a tell that appeared whenever he was preparing to navigate difficult terrain. "Your mother has been worried," he said finally. "Has she? Or has she been embarrassed?" Charles considered the question with the same methodical approach he brought to legal briefs. "Perhaps both. They're not mutually exclusive." Emma sat on the edge of her bed, the same four-poster that had witnessed her teenage dreams and disappointments. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Father. I'm here because it's your anniversary, and despite everything, you're still my parents." "Despite everything," Charles repeated softly. "That's a heavy phrase, Emma." Before she could respond, Henry appeared in the doorway. His presence shifted the dynamic immediately, adding warmth to what had been a careful diplomatic exchange. "The sunset is particularly beautiful tonight," Henry observed, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens. "Your grandmother always said that Surrey sunsets were God's way of apologizing for London weather." Emma joined him at the window. Below, the gardens stretched out in perfect geometric patterns, each hedge trimmed to mathematical precision, each flower bed arranged according to color theory and seasonal blooming schedules. It was beautiful in the way that museum pieces are beautiful, untouchable and slightly unreal. "I used to watch the gardeners from this window," Emma said. "I always wondered what would happen if they just stopped, if they let everything grow wild for just one season." Henry smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your grandmother wondered the same thing. She used to sketch the gardens as they might look if nature had its way, all overgrown paths and wildflowers pushing through the hedges." Charles frowned. "Mother never mentioned that." "Your mother mentions many things that Elizabeth thought," Henry replied diplomatically. "But not everything." The sound of car doors slamming outside announced the arrival of the catering team's final preparations. Margaret's voice drifted up from the entrance hall, coordinating the placement of tables in the conservatory with military precision. "I should help her," Emma said, though her tone suggested duty rather than enthusiasm. "She would appreciate that," Charles agreed, though they all knew that Margaret's appreciation would come wrapped in criticism and subtle corrections. As Emma left the room, Henry placed a gentle hand on his son's arm. "She's not the enemy, Charles." "I know that," Charles replied, but his voice carried the uncertainty of someone trying to convince himself. "It's just complicated." "The best things usually are," Henry observed, his gaze returning to the gardens where the last light of day was painting the perfectly manicured landscape in shades of gold and amber. "Your mother used to say that love without honesty is just elaborate pretending." Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling that had been plaguing him for months as he struggled with the Morrison case, as he watched his daughter drift further away, as he realized that the life he had built with such careful precision might be nothing more than an elaborate performance with an audience of one. Outside, the first guests would be arriving soon, and the Pemberton family would once again take their positions on the stage of Surrey society, each playing their assigned roles with the expertise that comes from decades of practice. The glass-enclosed conservatory had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, though Emma thought grimly that it was the kind of fairy tale where beautiful surfaces concealed darker truths. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of the illuminated gardens, where strategically placed spotlights turned every hedge and flower bed into a piece of living art. The guests arrived in waves, each couple more polished than the last. There was Lord and Lady Ashworth from the neighbouring estate, their titles as carefully maintained as their appearances. David Richardson, Charles's business partner, appeared with his wife Sarah, both wearing the kind of confident smiles that came from never having to question their place in the world. Mrs. Whitmore, the neighbour who had lived in Surrey for 30 years and knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves, glided between groups like a social archaeologist, collecting and cataloguing information for future use. Emma positioned herself near the windows, a crystal flute of champagne in her hand, serving as both prop and shield. From this vantage point, she could observe the intricate social dance that her parents navigated with such practiced ease. Margaret floated between groups, her laugh perfectly modulated for each audience, her conversation topics selected with the precision of a sommelier choosing wine pairings. Charles commanded attention without seeming to seek it, his legal reputation preceding him into every conversation cluster. "Emma Pemberton, is that really you?" Mrs. Whitmore materialized beside her with the stealth of someone who had perfected the art of gathering information. "My dear, you look so metropolitan." Emma smiled, recognizing the code. Metropolitan meant slightly too sophisticated, probably too independent, possibly corrupted by city values. "Mrs. Whitmore, you look exactly the same as always." Which was true. Mrs. Whitmore had achieved that ageless quality that came from expensive skin care and careful preservation of what had once been considerable beauty. "And what are you doing in London? Still with that little magazine?" The dismissal in Little Magazine was expertly delivered, but Emma had learned to parry such attacks during 2 years of defending her choices to skeptical interview subjects and dismissive sources. Investigative journalism, actually, We focus on corporate accountability and government transparency. How noble, Mrs. Whitmore replied, the pause before noble loaded with meaning. Though I imagine it must be difficult, constantly looking for problems where there might not be any. Before Emma could respond, her father's voice cut through the conversational hum. Charles was holding court near the center of the room, regaling a small group with a story about a recent legal victory. Emma found herself listening despite her better judgment. The key, Charles was saying, is understanding that every case has layers. What appears straightforward on the surface often conceals complexities that require careful navigation. David Richardson nodded sagely. Speaking of complex cases, how are you managing the Morrison situation? I heard it's become rather challenging. Emma's attention sharpened. The Morrison case. She had seen that name in her own research files. A whistleblower complaint about environmental violations that had mysteriously disappeared from public records. Her father's law firm was representing the corporation accused of covering up toxic waste dumping. Charles's smile remained perfectly in place, but Emma caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Every client deserves vigorous representation within the bounds of the law, he said smoothly. It's not our job to judge, only to ensure fair legal process. Even when the evidence is rather damning, asked Professor Williams, a retired academic who had known the family for years. Especially then, Charles replied. Justice depends on the system working properly, regardless of public opinion or media pressure. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd been investigating similar cases for months, following paper trails of corporate malfeasance and legal maneuvering that kept environmental criminals out of prison. The Morrison case was supposed to be her next major story. She had sources, documents, evidence of a cover-up that reached from boardrooms to courtrooms. Her father was on the other side. Margaret appeared at Emma's elbow as if summoned by maternal radar. "Darling, you look pale. Are you feeling well?" "Fine," Emma managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Just thinking." "Well, try not to think too hard," Margaret said with a laugh that carried just enough edge to serve as warning. "It's a party after all." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful observation. Emma spoke with cousins she barely remembered, smiled at jokes she didn't find funny, and accepted compliments on her appearance that felt more like evaluations than praise. All the while, she watched her parents work the room with professional efficiency, each playing their role in the elaborate performance of successful marriage and family harmony. As the evening progressed, the champagne flowed more freely, and the conversations grew slightly less guarded. Emma overheard fragments of discussion about business deals and political connections, charity fundraisers and social obligations. It was a world she had grown up in but never truly belonged to, a world where moral complexity was smoothed over by good breeding and expensive education. When Charles finally called for attention to begin the formal toasts, Emma felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had not planned to speak, had hoped to remain invisible in the crowd of well-wishers and social obligations. But as her father raised his glass and began to speak about 25 years of marriage built on solid values and mutual respect, she felt something inside her begin to fracture. The applause was polite and sustained, the kind of approval that comes from an audience that knows its role. Margaret beamed beside her husband, the perfect image of a woman whose life had unfolded exactly according to plan. And then Charles was looking at Emma, his smile expectant, his hand extended in invitation. "Perhaps our daughter would like to say a few words about family and the values that bind us together." Emma stood slowly, the crystal champagne flute feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. The conservatory fell silent, except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of wind moving through the garden trees. 50 pairs of eyes focused on her with the polite attention that Surrey society reserved for potentially awkward moments. ready to either applaud graciously or forget diplomatically, depending on what unfolded. Margaret's smile was frozen in place, a perfect mask of maternal pride that concealed what Emma recognized as barely controlled anxiety. Charles maintained his confident posture, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his own glass. Only Henry seemed genuinely curious about what she might say, his weathered face showing the kind of interest that came from someone who had lived long enough to value authenticity over propriety. 25 years, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. It's remarkable, isn't it, how we measure success? 25 years of marriage, a beautiful home, successful careers, respected positions in the community. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests, noting the subtle nods of agreement, the comfortable assumptions about shared values. But I find myself wondering about the cost of such success. What do we sacrifice to maintain these beautiful facades? What truths do we bury in our perfectly manicured gardens? The atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Smiles became slightly more fixed, postures straightened, and Emma could feel her mother's tension radiating across the space like heat from a flame. My parents taught me about responsibility, about duty, about the importance of maintaining one's position in society. They taught me that reputation is everything, that appearance matters more than almost anything else. Emma's voice remained calm, conversational, but her words carried an undercurrent that made several guests shift uncomfortably. What they didn't teach me was how to reconcile those lessons with integrity, how to sleep at night when your success comes at the expense of truth, how to look at yourself in the mirror when you've spent your life polishing surfaces instead of examining what lies beneath them. David Richardson cleared his throat softly, a sound that might have been agreement or warning. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes had sharpened with the predatory interest of someone sensing social drama. Lord Ashworth was studying his champagne with the intensity of a wine critic, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Emma continued, her journalist's instincts taking over. We live in a world where corporations dump toxic waste and hire prestigious law firms to make the consequences disappear, where wealthy families throw elegant parties while the communities they've poisoned suffer in silence, where success is measured not by the good we do, but by how effectively we can avoid accountability for the harm we cause. Margaret's face had gone pale, but her smile remained in place through sheer force of will. Charles had straightened to his full height, his lawyer's instincts recognizing the opening arguments of a case he didn't want to fight in public. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle warning of a parent trying to redirect a wayward child. But Emma was beyond redirection. 2 years of London journalism had taught her that the most important stories were often the ones that people didn't want told, and she had stumbled into the biggest story of her career without leaving. "Sorry." "So I raise my glass," Emma said, lifting her champagne flute toward the crystal chandelier, "to 25 years of marriage, to success built on careful omissions, and to the courage it takes to finally ask the questions that no one wants answered." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of collective disapproval settling over the room like fog. Some guests were staring at their hands, others exchanging meaningful glances, all of them suddenly very interested in anything except the young woman who had just violated the fundamental rule of polite society: never disturb the peace with unwelcome truths. Charles recovered first, his professional training kicking in. "Thank you, Emma," he said smoothly, his tone suggesting that her remarks had been charmingly naive rather than deliberately provocative. "Youth brings such an interesting perspective to family celebrations." The nervous laughter that followed was relief disguised as amusement. Mrs. Whitmore began talking animatedly to Professor Williams about the weather forecast. Lord Ashworth discovered an urgent need to examine the garden lighting through the windows. The party machinery of Surrey society ground back into motion, processing the awkward moment and preparing to forget it had ever happened. But Emma wasn't finished. "Actually, Father, I have one more thing to say." The room stilled again, this time with the tension of a crowd watching a tightrope walker who had already fallen once. "I'm working on a story about the Morrison case, about corporate environmental crimes and the legal strategies used to avoid prosecution, about how prestigious law firms help wealthy clients escape justice while communities suffer the consequences." Emma's voice was steady now, professional, carrying the authority of someone who had done her research. "I thought you should know that when the story publishes, your law firm will be prominently featured, not as villains, of course, as participants in a legal system that values profit over people, reputation over responsibility." The silence that followed was no longer polite or uncomfortable. It was the silence of a social nuclear explosion, the kind of moment that Surrey society would remember and discuss in whispers for years to come. Emma set her champagne glass on the nearest table with deliberate care. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said to the room in general. "I think I'll take some air in the gardens." As she walked toward the French doors that led outside, Emma could feel the weight of 50 shocked gazes following her exit. Behind her, she heard her father's voice beginning damage control, her mother's bright laughter attempting to restore normalcy, and the tentative resumption of conversation as the guests tried to process what they had just witnessed. But Emma was already gone, stepping out into the cool night air where the perfectly maintained gardens stretched before her like a living metaphor for everything she had just rejected. The garden air felt sharp and clean after the perfumed atmosphere of the conservatory, but Emma found no peace in the cool darkness. She walked the gravel paths between precisely trimmed hedges, her heels clicking against stone like a metronome counting down to disaster. Behind her, the party continued with forced normalcy. She could hear the rise and fall of conversation, the careful laughter of people pretending that nothing extraordinary had happened. 20 minutes passed before the French doors opened again. Margaret emerged first, her silk dress rustling against the doorframe, followed by Charles and finally Henry, who moved with the careful deliberation of age. The family gathered on the terrace like actors taking their positions for the final scene of a particularly tragic play. "The guests are leaving," Margaret announced, her voice hollow. "Early, but gracefully. Mrs. Whitmore made sure to tell me how stimulating she found your speech." Emma turned to face them, noting how different they looked outside their natural habitat. Without the conservatory's flattering light and supportive audience, they seemed smaller, more vulnerable. Charles had loosened his tie slightly, a concession to stress that would have been unthinkable inside. "I suppose you're proud of yourself," Margaret continued, her composure finally beginning to crack. 25 years of building a reputation, and you've managed to undermine it in 5 minutes. "I told the truth," Emma replied simply. "Your version of the truth," Charles corrected, his lawyer's precision intact despite his obvious fatigue. "Based on incomplete information and juvenile idealism." "Incomplete?" Emma stepped closer to her father, her journalistic instincts flaring. "I have documents, Charles. Internal memos about cover-up strategies. Correspondence between your firm and Morrison Industries about managing public perception. I know about the settlement negotiations that included non-disclosure agreements designed to silence victims." Charles's face went ashen. "How did you—" "Those documents are privileged. Not all of them. Some came from whistleblowers. Others were leaked by people who couldn't stomach being part of the cover-up." Emma's voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent months building an airtight case. "I know about the children in Millbrook who developed asthma clusters after Morrison's illegal dumping. I know about the groundwater contamination that your firm helped hide. Margaret sank onto a stone bench, her perfect posture finally collapsing. "Emma, please, think about what you're doing. Think about our family." "I am thinking about our family," Emma shot back. "I'm thinking about what kind of family we are when we value our comfort over other people's lives. I'm thinking about what kind of daughter I am if I stay silent about crimes just because my father helped commit them." "I didn't commit any crimes," Charles said sharply. "I provided legal representation within the bounds of the law." "Legal isn't the same as moral," Emma replied. "You know that. You taught me that, actually, back when you still believed your own principles." Henry cleared his throat softly, the sound carrying surprising authority in the tense silence. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "this conversation would benefit from less accusation and more listening." Charles whirled toward his father. "Listening? She just humiliated us in front of half of Surrey. She's threatening to destroy my career, our reputation, everything we've built." "Everything we've built on what foundation?" Henry asked quietly. "Your mother would have asked the same question." The mention of Elizabeth hit the family like a physical blow. Margaret's breath caught audibly, Charles's hands clenched into fists, and Emma felt her anger falter slightly in the face of her grandfather's sudden sadness. "Don't bring Mother into this," Margaret warned, but her voice lacked conviction. Henry reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a yellowed envelope, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Elizabeth left this for Emma before she died. You refused to let me give it to her then. You said she was too young, too impressionable, but she's 26 now, and I think she's old enough to hear what her grandmother wanted to tell her." Margaret stood up sharply. "Henry, no. Mother was sick at the end. She wasn't thinking clearly." "She was thinking more clearly than any of us," Henry replied firmly. "She knew what this family was becoming, what compromises we were making, what prices we were paying for our precious respectability." Emma stared at the envelope as if it might contain explosives. "What does it say?" "It says," Henry replied, looking directly at his son and daughter-in-law, "that she left you money, enough money to be independent, to make choices based on your conscience rather than your circumstances. Money that was legally yours when you turned 21, money that Margaret has been hiding from you for 5 years. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. She looked at her mother, seeing guilt and desperation warring in Margaret's face. "You kept my inheritance from me?" "I was protecting you," Margaret whispered, "from making the same mistakes Elizabeth made, from choosing principle over security, idealism over practical wisdom." "Whose practical wisdom?" Emma demanded. "Yours? The wisdom that says it's better to live a lie than risk being uncomfortable? The wisdom that values reputation over integrity?" Charles stepped between them, his protective instincts finally overriding his professional composure. "Enough. This ends now. Emma, you're upset. We're all upset. But destroying this family won't solve anything." "I'm not destroying anything," Emma said, her voice suddenly weary. "I'm trying to save it. From turning into something grandmother would be ashamed of. From becoming the kind of family that puts comfort before conscience." She looked at each of them in turn, her mother, pale and shaking, her father, rigid with barely controlled anger, her grandfather, sad but resolute. "I came here tonight, hoping to find my family again. Instead, I found strangers wearing familiar faces." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with years of unspoken resentments and carefully avoided truths. In the distance, car engines started as the last guests departed, leaving the Pemberton family alone with the wreckage of their carefully constructed evening. "So what happens now?" Charles asked finally, his voice stripped of its usual authority. Emma looked at the envelope in Henry's hands, then at the house where she had grown up, learning to value appearance over authenticity. "Now," she said quietly, "we decide who we really are when no one is watching." Henry extended the envelope toward Emma with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, she couldn't tell. The paper was cream-coloured and heavy, the kind of stationery that Margaret still ordered from Harrods despite the expense. Emma's name was written across it in Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting, the loops and curves she remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes that had stopped coming when she was 16. "Before you read it," Margaret said desperately, "you need to understand the context. Your grandmother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She was confused about many things toward the end." Henry's face hardened. "Elizabeth's mind was sharp as a blade until the day she died. The dementia diagnosis was wishful thinking on your part, Margaret, a convenient way to dismiss her opinions when they became inconvenient." Charles ran a hand through his hair, disturbing his carefully styled appearance for the first time all evening. "This is insane. We're standing in our garden at midnight, arguing about a dead woman's letter, while our daughter threatens to destroy our family's reputation. Does anyone else see the irony here?" Emma broke the wax seal with hands that weren't quite steady. The letter was written on matching stationery, several pages thick, dated just 3 months before Elizabeth's death. Her grandmother's handwriting was as precise and elegant as she remembered. "My dearest Emma," she read aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "If you are reading this letter, it means I am gone, and it means that your mother has finally been forced to surrender what was never hers to keep." Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. Emma continued reading. "I am writing this because I see in you the same spirit that I once had, the same dangerous tendency to value truth over comfort, principle over pragmatism. Your mother sees this as a character flaw to be corrected. Your father sees it as youthful idealism to be outgrown. I see it as the family's only hope for redemption." Charles shifted uncomfortably. "Emma, you don't need to read this to us. It's private." "No," Emma said firmly. "It's not private, not anymore." She continued reading. "I was once like you, my dear. I believed in justice, in speaking truth to power, in using whatever privilege I had to help those who had less. I was a suffragette in my youth. Did you know that? I was arrested twice for protesting outside Parliament. Your grandfather thought he was marrying a decorative wife. Instead, he got a revolutionary." Henry smiled sadly. "She was magnificent when she was angry, like a force of nature." "But then I did what women of my generation did," Emma continued reading. "I traded my principles for security. I exchanged my voice for a comfortable life. I learned to smile prettily and say nothing when I saw injustice. I became complicit in a system I had once fought against." Margaret was crying now, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "She doesn't understand. The choices we made, the sacrifices, they were for you, for the family." "Listen," Emma said sharply, then continued reading. "Your mother made the same bargain I did, Emma. She had artistic talent, real talent. She could have been a serious painter, could have said something meaningful about the world through her work. Instead, she chose to arrange flowers and organize charity luncheons, to be the perfect wife to a successful husband." Emma looked up at Margaret, seeing her mother as if for the first time. "You were an artist." "I dabbled," Margaret said dismissively, but her voice cracked on the words. "You didn't dabble," Henry corrected gently. "You were accepted to the Royal College of Art. You turned down the scholarship to marry Charles." Charles stared at his wife in shock. "You never told me about art college." "It wasn't important," Margaret whispered. "It was just a foolish dream." Emma returned to the letter. "I am leaving you money, Emma. Enough to be independent. Enough to make choices based on your conscience rather than your circumstances. Your mother will try to convince you that financial security is more important than personal integrity. She will tell you that compromise is necessary, that idealism is a luxury you cannot afford." The letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing specific amounts and account numbers, but also something more valuable: Elizabeth's perspective on the family's gradual moral decline. She wrote about watching Charles take cases that compromised his stated principles, about seeing Margaret abandon her artistic ambitions in favor of social climbing, about the slow erosion of authentic values in favor of comfortable lies. "She ends with this," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Remember, my darling girl, that golden chains are still chains. The comfort that comes from compromising your principles is not peace. It is the numbness that comes from slow spiritual death. Be brave enough to live authentically, even if authenticity costs you everything this family thinks is important." Emma folded the letter carefully, her hands steady now, despite the magnitude of what she had just learned. The inheritance was substantial, enough to be truly independent, enough to pursue journalism without worrying about rent or student loans, enough to take on powerful people without fear of economic retaliation. But more than the money, the letter offered something else: permission to be herself, validation from the one person in the family who had understood the cost of choosing security over authenticity. "She was wrong," Margaret said finally, her voice hollow. "About me, about the choices I made. I wasn't happy before Charles. I was scared and alone and uncertain about everything. The art, the scholarship, those were dreams, not reality." "Were they?" Emma asked gently. "Or were they just inconvenient when you decided that being Mrs. Charles Pemberton was safer than being Margaret the artist?" Charles looked between his wife and daughter, seeing the conversation shift into territory where his legal training provided no useful guidance. "This is all very touching," he said finally, "but it doesn't change the fundamental issue. Emma, if you publish that story about Morrison, you won't just be destroying my career. You'll be destroying everything we've built as a family." Emma met her father's eyes steadily. "Maybe it's time to build something better." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Emma realized that this was the moment of decision, not just for her, but for all of them. The letter had given her the means to be independent, but independence was only valuable if she had the courage to use it wisely. "I'm going to publish the story," she said quietly. "Not because I want to hurt you, but because those children in Millbrook deserve to have their story told. Because the families who were poisoned deserve justice more than we deserve comfort." But even as she spoke, Emma found herself thinking about Elizabeth's words, about the price of principles and the complexity of family love. "However," she continued slowly, "I want to offer you a choice. I can write the story as an exposé that destroys you, or I can write it as something else, a story about a family that found the courage to change course." Margaret looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that grandmother's inheritance changes everything. With that money as a safety net, father could transition to environmental law. You could pursue art seriously. I could write stories that matter without worrying about salary." Emma's voice gained strength as she spoke. "We could use our privilege to help instead of harm." Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "You're talking about dismantling 30 years of career building." "I'm talking about 30 years of building something that actually matters," Emma replied. "Grandmother left us more than money. She left us a roadmap for redemption." Henry stepped forward, his weathered face showing the first real hope Emma had seen all evening. Elizabeth would be proud of this conversation, not the pain of it, but the possibility in it. "And if we refuse?" Margaret asked quietly. "If we choose to keep our current life?" Emma felt the weight of the moment, understanding that her answer would define not just her relationship with her family, but the kind of person she would become. "Then I publish the story anyway, and we lose each other, because I can't pretend anymore that reputation matters more than truth." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of distant traffic and the gentle rustle of perfectly maintained hedges. In the darkness of the Surrey garden, surrounded by the monuments to their carefully constructed life, the Pemberton family faced the choice between comfortable lies and difficult truths. The first grey light of dawn found Emma walking the gravel paths alone, her evening dress exchanged for jeans and a sweater borrowed from her old wardrobe. The gardens looked different in the early morning light, less manicured, more vulnerable. Dew clung to the perfectly trimmed hedges like tears, and she could see the subtle imperfections that the strategic lighting had hidden. Brown spots on rose leaves, gaps in the hedge where growth was uneven, patches of lawn where the grass grew thin despite careful cultivation. She had not slept. After the confrontation on the terrace, the family had dispersed to their separate corners of the house like wounded animals seeking solitude. Emma had spent the hours until dawn, sitting by her bedroom window. Elizabeth's letter spread on the desk beside her, reading and rereading her grandmother's words until they were memorized. The inheritance was real. She had verified the account numbers online, had seen the substantial balance that had been growing with interest for 5 years. Elizabeth had been thorough in her planning, even including contact information for a London solicitor who had been waiting for Emma to claim what was rightfully hers. The money represented freedom, but Emma was beginning to understand that freedom was more complicated than she had imagined. At the far end of the garden, where the manicured lawns gave way to a small copse of oak trees, Emma found a stone bench that had been Elizabeth's favorite spot. She remembered sitting here as a child, listening to her grandmother's stories about the suffragettes, about women who had chosen difficult paths in pursuit of principles that seemed abstract to a 10-year-old girl. She used to sit there every morning with her tea. Henry's voice came from behind her. Emma turned to see her grandfather approaching slowly, carrying 2 steaming mugs. Said it was the only place on the property where she could think clearly. Emma accepted the tea gratefully, recognizing the blend Elizabeth had always preferred, Earl Grey with a touch of honey. "How long have you been awake?" "I don't sleep much anymore," Henry admitted, settling beside her on the bench. "Age has its disadvantages, but insomnia isn't entirely one of them. It gives you time to think, to remember things you might otherwise forget." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun gradually brighten the eastern sky. Emma could hear the distant sounds of the house awakening, water running through pipes, the soft closing of doors, the careful footsteps of people trying not to disturb others while being unable to sleep themselves. "Tell me about her," Emma said finally. "About grandmother when she was young. Mother never talks about it." Henry's face softened with memory. Elizabeth was magnificent, fierce and funny and absolutely fearless when she believed in something. She organized protests, wrote pamphlets, gave speeches that could move people to tears or action, sometimes both. When I met her, she was 22 and had just been released from Holloway Prison for chaining herself to the gates of Downing Street. Emma tried to reconcile this image with her memories of the gentle grandmother who had taught her to paint watercolors and make proper tea. What changed? "Life," Henry said simply. "The war came, then the Depression. Fighting for principles is easier when you don't have children depending on you for security. Elizabeth made the same choice that millions of women made. She chose safety over truth, comfort over courage, but she never stopped regretting it. Is that why she left me the money? Guilt?" Henry considered the question carefully. "Partly, but mostly hope. She saw in you the same fire she'd had, and she wanted to make sure you had choices she never had. Money provides options, Emma. It's not the answer to moral questions, but it makes it easier to live with the answers you choose." Emma thought about the Morrison case, about the story she had spent months researching, about the children in Millbrook whose health had been sacrificed for corporate profits. "Do you think I'm wrong about the story?" "I think," Henry said slowly, "that there are different kinds of wrongness. There's the wrongness of causing harm, and there's the wrongness of allowing harm to continue unchallenged. Your father isn't evil, Emma. He's just tired of fighting battles that seem unwinnable, tired of being responsible for everyone else's welfare, tired of making choices between bad options and worse ones." But that doesn't excuse... No, Henry agreed firmly. It doesn't excuse anything, but understanding isn't the same as excusing. Your father believes he's protecting the family by taking cases like Morrison. You believe you're protecting justice by exposing those cases. You're both right, and you're both wrong, and that's what makes it tragic rather than simple. Emma drained her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Mother thinks I'm trying to destroy the family. Your mother thinks anything that threatens the stability she's built is destruction, Henry replied. She's forgotten that sometimes you have to tear down rotten foundations before you can build something solid. From the house, Emma could hear the soft sounds of breakfast preparation. Margaret, she knew, would be in the kitchen despite having a cook, arranging everything with the same precision she brought to flower arrangements and social events. Charles would be in his study, probably already on his laptop, dealing with the professional consequences of last night's revelations. What would grandmother do? Emma asked. If she were my age, with my opportunities, what would she choose? Henry smiled, his weathered face crinkling with affection and sadness. She would tell you that the question isn't what she would do, but what you can live with. She would say that compromise is sometimes necessary, but that you have to know which lines you won't cross. And why? Emma stood, feeling suddenly restless. The sun was fully up now, revealing the gardens in their full artificial perfection. I keep thinking about those children in Millbrook, about families who don't have the luxury of choosing between comfort and principle because they're just trying to survive the consequences of other people's choices. And that, Henry said quietly, is exactly what Elizabeth hoped you would think about. Boom! As Emma walked back toward the house, she could see movement behind the kitchen windows. Her parents beginning their own morning routines, probably discussing damage control strategies and family crisis management. The sight filled her with a mixture of love and frustration that she was beginning to recognize as the permanent condition of family relationships. She thought about the story waiting on her laptop in London, about the Morrison case files that represented months of careful investigation, about the children whose health had been sacrificed for the sake of legal maneuvering and corporate profits. She thought about her father's career, her mother's carefully constructed social position, the inheritance that would allow her to pursue truth regardless of personal cost. Most of all, she thought about Elizabeth's final words in the letter: "Be brave enough to live authentically, even if authenticity costs you everything this family thinks is important." The question was whether she was brave enough to risk losing her family in order to save her integrity, or whether there might be a third option that no one had considered yet. The morning sunlight streaming through the breakfast room windows revealed the subtle devastation that the previous evening had wrought on the Pemberton family. Margaret moved through the familiar ritual of setting the table with mechanical precision, but her usual attention to detail was compromised by exhaustion. The marmalade was slightly off-center, the napkins imperfectly folded, small imperfections that would normally have been unthinkable, but now seemed to reflect the larger disruption in their carefully ordered world. Charles sat at the head of the table with his laptop open, ostensibly reading the morning news, but actually staring at the same paragraph for the third time. His BlackBerry had been buzzing intermittently since 6 a.m., with messages from partners at the firm, clients expressing concern, and one particularly ominous text from David Richardson requesting an urgent meeting. The Morrison case, which had been a routine corporate defense matter yesterday, was now a potential career-ending liability. Emma entered the breakfast room wearing jeans and a simple white blouse, the kind of understated clothing that somehow made her look more adult than her evening dress had. She carried Elizabeth's letter folded carefully in her hand, and Henry followed a few steps behind, his presence providing a buffer of calm in the tense atmosphere. "Coffee?" Margaret asked, her voice studiously neutral. She poured without waiting for an answer, her movements careful and controlled. It was the kind of forced normalcy that followed family crises, the pretense that ordinary routines could somehow restore extraordinary disruptions to manageable proportions. "Thank you," Emma replied, equally carefully. She sat across from her father, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he lifted his coffee cup. These were not the hands of a man comfortable with his choices. Henry settled into his usual chair with the deliberate movement of age, but his eyes were alert and watchful. He had lived through enough family crises to recognize the delicate nature of this moment, the point where wounds could either begin healing or deepen into permanent scars. The silence stretched between them, filled with the small sounds of morning routine, the clink of spoons against china, the rustle of newspaper pages, the distant hum of traffic beginning to build on the roads. Beyond the estate, it was Margaret who finally broke. "The Ashworths called," she announced, her tone carefully casual. "They wanted to thank us for a memorable evening. I think we can assume that everyone who attended last night will be discussing our family drama over their own breakfast tables this morning." Emma winced slightly. She had been so focused on the moral imperative of truth-telling that she hadn't fully considered the social consequences for her parents. "I'm sorry about that. I didn't intend to embarrass you in front of your friends." "Didn't you?" Charles asked, looking up from his laptop. His tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. "Emma, I've spent 30 years building a reputation in this community. You destroyed it in 5 minutes. "I destroyed the illusion," Emma corrected gently. "The reputation was built on cases like Morrison, on helping corporations escape accountability for poisoning communities. That reputation needed to be destroyed." Margaret set down her coffee cup with enough force to make the china ring. "And what about my reputation? What about the charity boards I serve on, the committees I chair? Do you think those positions will survive the scandal of having a daughter who attacks her own father's livelihood?" Emma felt the familiar twist of guilt and frustration that came from trying to balance family loyalty with personal integrity. "Mother, those organizations, don't they exist to help people? Wouldn't they want to support someone exposing corporate crimes that harm children?" "You're so naive," Margaret said, but her voice lacked venom. She sounded more exhausted than angry. "Those organizations depend on donations from the same corporations and families that Charles represents. Scandal makes people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable people don't write checks." Henry cleared his throat softly, drawing attention with the gentle authority of age. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we might consider what Elizabeth would think of this conversation." Charles bristled. "Mother is dead, Dad. Her opinions, however admirable, don't pay mortgages or put food on tables or fund retirement accounts." "No," Henry agreed calmly, "but they do provide guidance on how to live with yourself after the mortgages are paid and the retirement accounts are funded." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member in turn. "Elizabeth used to say that there are 2 kinds of inheritance you can leave your children: money and values. She left both." Emma unfolded the letter, spreading it carefully on the table. "The inheritance is substantial, more than enough for me to be financially independent. But more importantly, it's enough to allow all of us to make different choices." Charles frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she had made during her dawn walk in the gardens. "I'm going to publish the Morrison story, not because I want to hurt you, but because the truth needs to be told. But I'm also going to write a follow-up piece about a family lawyer who recognized that he had been compromising his values and decided to change course." Margaret stared at her daughter. "You want your father to quit his job?" "I want him to quit taking cases that require him to defend the indefensible," Emma clarified. "There are other kinds of law, other ways to use his skills. Environmental law, civil rights work, pro bono cases for families who can't afford justice." Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Emma, those cases don't pay enough to maintain this lifestyle." The house, the cars, your mother's social commitments, then we'll live differently, Emma interrupted. We'll live smaller, more honestly. The inheritance from grandmother can help with the transition, and maybe eventually we'll discover that we don't need as much as we thought we did. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about the art classes at the community college. They offer watercolor workshops on Thursday evenings. The admission hung in the air like a small miracle. Charles stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, and Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. You could do that, Henry said encouragingly. Elizabeth's studio in the attic is still there, still has all her supplies. It's been waiting for someone to use it again. Charles closed his laptop with a decisive click. You're all insane, he said, but his tone suggested consideration rather than dismissal. I'm 55 years old. Starting over at this age is exactly what grandmother did when she married grandfather, Emma pointed out. She was older than you are now when she decided to choose love over activism. Maybe it's time to choose activism over money. The conversation continued for another hour, tentative and careful, with long pauses, while each family member processed possibilities they had never seriously considered. There were no dramatic declarations or tearful reconciliations, just the slow, difficult work of reimagining their lives around different values. By the time they finished breakfast, they had the outline of a plan. Emma would publish her Morrison story, but include a section about corporate lawyers who choose to change course. Charles would begin the process of transitioning away from corporate defense work. Margaret would explore returning to art. Henry would help organize Elizabeth's papers and perhaps work on the memoir he had always talked about writing. It wasn't a perfect solution, and they all knew that implementation would be harder than planning. But for the first time since Emma had walked through the front door, the family was moving in the same direction instead of pulling against each other. As they cleared the breakfast dishes together, a task that Margaret usually left to the housekeeper but somehow felt necessary this morning, Emma caught her reflection in the dining room mirror. She looked tired, but oddly peaceful, like someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight she hadn't realized was unbearable. Outside the windows, the Surrey Gardens stretched away in their geometric perfection, but Emma found herself imagining what they might look like with a few wild patches, a few areas where growth was allowed to follow its natural patterns rather than human design. Change, she thought, didn't have to mean destruction. Sometimes it just meant allowing room for something different to grow. The spring rain drummed gently against the conservatory windows, blurring the view of gardens that had subtly transformed over the winter months. Margaret had convinced the groundskeeper to leave a corner section wild, a small rebellion against decades of rigid landscape control that had yielded surprising results. Bluebells and wild primrose now grew alongside the formal plantings, creating an unexpected harmony between cultivation and natural growth. Emma stood before an easel in what had once been Elizabeth's studio, her hands stained with watercolor pigments as she worked on a landscape that captured this new version of the Surrey Gardens. The attic space had been transformed from storage repository to working studio, with canvases stacked against the walls and natural light streaming through skylights that Charles had installed as a surprise birthday gift for Margaret. The changes in the Pemberton family had been gradual but profound. Emma's Morrison investigation had won a National Journalism Award and led to criminal charges against 3 corporate executives, but the follow-up piece about Charles's career transition had garnered equally significant attention. The legal profession, it seemed, was hungry for stories about attorneys choosing conscience over profit, and Charles had found himself in unexpected demand as a speaker at law schools and professional conferences. His transition from corporate defender to environmental advocate had been financially challenging but professionally rewarding. The family had sold the Surrey mansion, too large and expensive for their new circumstances, and moved to a smaller but equally beautiful cottage in the Cotswolds. The reduction in overhead had allowed Charles to take on cases that aligned with his values rather than his bank account, representing communities fighting environmental degradation and families seeking justice against corporate malfeasance. Margaret's artistic renaissance had surprised everyone, including herself. Her Thursday evening watercolor classes had led to weekend workshops, then to a small gallery showing in the nearby village, and finally to a commissioned series of paintings documenting the environmental restoration efforts that Charles's legal work supported. She had discovered that her years of organizing charity events had given her unexpected skills in art world networking and community building. "The light is perfect today," Margaret observed, climbing the attic stairs with 2 cups of tea. She had adapted to the cottage's smaller scale by embracing a more hands-on domesticity, finding unexpected pleasure in cooking and gardening without the buffer of hired help. Very Elizabeth. Emma accepted the tea gratefully, noting how much more relaxed her mother looked. The constant tension that had characterized Margaret's Surrey social performance had been replaced by a quieter confidence that came from pursuing meaningful work rather than maintaining appearances. "Any word from the London publisher?" Margaret asked, settling into the reading chair that had been moved up from Emma's childhood bedroom. Emma nodded, unable to suppress a smile. "They want the full manuscript by autumn. Apparently, memoirs about families choosing authenticity over security are having a moment." The book project had emerged organically from Emma's continued journalism work and the family's ongoing conversations about values and choices. What had begun as personal reflection had evolved into something larger, an exploration of how families could navigate the tension between loyalty and integrity, between comfort and conscience. Henry's contribution to the project had been invaluable. At 79, he had finally begun writing his own memoir, focusing on the social changes he had witnessed and the quiet courage required to live authentically in any era. His weekly visits to the cottage included long conversations about family history that provided context for Emma's broader themes about inherited values and chosen principles. Charles appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from the rain and his expression carrying the particular satisfaction that came from meaningful work. "The Millbrook case settled," he announced. "Full cleanup costs, medical monitoring for all affected families, and a community health fund. Morrison Industries is finally going to face real consequences." Emma set down her brush, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The victory was significant, but it had taken 2 years of legal battles to achieve what should have been an immediate response to environmental crime. What about the executives? Prison time. Not enough, but more than they expected when they started covering up the contamination. Charles settled onto a paint-splattered stool, looking tired, but genuinely happy. "The lead prosecutor mentioned your original investigation, said it provided the roadmap for their entire case." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the gravel drive. Emma looked out the window to see a familiar figure emerging from a London taxi, David Richardson, Charles's former law partner, carrying an expensive briefcase and wearing the kind of suit that Emma remembered from her Surrey childhood. "Unexpected guest," Margaret observed, her tone carefully neutral. Relations with their former social circle had been complicated by the family's life changes, with some friends maintaining connection while others had quietly drifted away. Charles went downstairs to greet David, and Emma could hear the measured politeness of former colleagues navigating changed circumstances. When they climbed to the studio 20 minutes later, David's expression was a mixture of professional respect and personal bewilderment. "Quite a change from Surrey," he observed, taking in the artistic chaos of canvases and paint supplies. "A good change," Margaret replied firmly, her protective instincts emerging whenever someone seemed to question their choices. David turned to Charles with the focused attention of someone delivering important news. The Morrison settlement is generating significant attention in corporate circles. 3 other firms have called, asking if you'd consider consulting on environmental defense, but from the plaintiff's side this time, the money would be substantial. Emma watched her father's face carefully, recognizing the moment of decision that had become familiar over the past months. The old Charles would have calculated financial implications and professional advantages. The new Charles seemed to be weighing different considerations entirely. "Interesting," Charles said finally. "But I've learned to ask different questions now. Would the work help communities that have been harmed? Would it advance environmental justice? Would it allow me to sleep soundly?" David looked puzzled. "I'm not sure those are the right questions for a successful legal career. They're the right questions for a successful life," Charles replied, and Emma felt a surge of pride at hearing her father articulate values that had taken months of difficult conversation to clarify. After David left, politely declining tea and seeming eager to return to the familiar world of billable hours and professional networking, the family gathered in the cottage's small sitting room. The space was cozy rather than grand, filled with Margaret's paintings and Henry's books, and the comfortable chaos of people who had stopped performing perfect domesticity. "Any regrets?" Emma asked, the question that had become a family ritual during their Sunday evening conversations. Margaret considered the question seriously, as she always did. "About the life we left behind? Sometimes I miss the convenience of unlimited resources. But I don't miss the constant performance, the feeling that every choice was being evaluated by an invisible audience of social judges." Charles nodded in agreement. "The work is harder now, more emotionally demanding, less financially rewarding, but it's actually work, not just professional positioning. I feel like a lawyer again, instead of a corporate spokesperson." Emma curled up in the window seat that overlooked their small garden, where Margaret's wildflower experiments were beginning to bloom. "I keep thinking about grandmother's letter about golden chains. We traded the chains for something messier but more real." Henry, who had stayed for dinner and was now settled by the fireplace with a glass of port, raised his glass in a toast. "To Elizabeth," he said simply, "who understood that some inheritances are worth more than money." As evening deepened outside the cottage windows, the family continued their conversation about choices and consequences, about the ongoing work of living authentically in a world that often rewarded comfortable lies. There were still challenges ahead: financial pressures, professional adjustments, the daily effort required to maintain principles under pressure. But there was also something that had been missing from their Surrey life, the deep satisfaction that came from alignment between values and actions, between private beliefs and public choices. Emma's journalism continued to focus on environmental justice and corporate accountability. Charles's legal work supported communities fighting for clean air and water. Margaret's art documented the restoration efforts that followed environmental victories. Henry's memoir project connected their personal story to larger themes about social responsibility and individual courage. The transformation had not been easy or complete. They were still learning how to live differently, still discovering the practical implications of chosen principles. But they had found something that no amount of Surrey respectability had provided: the peace that comes from knowing that their comfortable life was not built on other people's suffering. As the family prepared for bed in their smaller but somehow more spacious cottage, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them from that tension-filled anniversary party to this quiet evening of rain and conversation and shared purpose. The gardens outside might be less perfect than Surrey's geometric precision, but they were growing according to their own natural patterns, finding their own balance between cultivation and wildness. Change, Emma had learned, was not a single dramatic gesture, but an ongoing commitment to growth, adjustment, and the courage to keep choosing authenticity even when comfort beckoned. The work was never finished, but that was what made it meaningful. The daily opportunity to decide again and again who they wanted to be when no one was watching except themselves. Step into the world of the Gardens of Surrey and discover how one family's perfectly manicured life unravels when truth collides with tradition. This powerful story explores the delicate balance between family loyalty and personal integrity, showing us that sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the deepest conflicts. Through Emma's courageous journalism and her family's painful but necessary transformation, we witness the profound cost of living authentically in a world that rewards comfortable lies. The Pemberton family's journey from their pristine Surrey mansion to a humble Cotswolds cottage reminds us that true success isn't measured by wealth or reputation, but by the courage to align our actions with our values. If this story of family, conscience, and redemption resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear Emma's message about choosing authenticity over appearance. Your engagement helps us bring more meaningful stories like this to audiences around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives that explore the complexities of human relationships and moral choices. We'd love to know, from which country are you watching this video? Drop a comment below and tell us how stories of family transformation and moral courage resonate in your part of the world.